The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the federal courthouse in Norfolk, Virginia. James Martinez pushed his cleaning cart down the marble hallway, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished floor. At 62 years old, he had been working as a janitor in this building for nearly 15 years, and he knew every corner, every office, and every person who walked these halls. James took pride in his work. Every morning he arrived at 5 o'clock sharp, 2 hours before the building officially opened. He would methodically clean each courtroom, empty every trash bin, and ensure that the floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The judges, lawyers, and staff had grown accustomed to seeing him quietly going about his duties, nearly invisible in his gray uniform. On this particular Tuesday morning, James was running slightly behind schedule. His wife, Maria, had fallen ill the night before, and he had spent extra time making sure she was comfortable before leaving for work. As he hurried to finish cleaning the main courtroom, he noticed that one of the witness chairs had a loose screw. Being the thorough man he was, James decided to fix it quickly, rather than leave it for the maintenance crew. He retrieved his small toolkit from his cart and knelt beside the chair, carefully tightening the loose hardware. The courtroom was peaceful and quiet, with only the soft hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. James had always found something almost sacred about these empty courtrooms in the early morning hours, before they filled with the drama and tension of legal proceedings. As he worked, James reflected on his life. He had immigrated to the United States from El Salvador 30 years ago, speaking very little English and carrying nothing but hope for a better future. Through hard work and determination, he had built a modest but honest life for himself and his family. His 2 children had both graduated from college, something that filled him with immense pride. His daughter was now a teacher, and his son worked as an engineer. The courthouse had become like a second home to James over the years. He had seen countless trials, witnessed moments of justice and injustice, and had developed a deep respect for the legal system, even if he didn't always understand its complexities. The judges and attorneys often greeted him warmly, and several had even attended his daughter's wedding the previous year. Just as James finished tightening the last screw and was putting his tools away, he heard the heavy footsteps of someone entering the courtroom. He looked up to see Bailiff Robert Thompson approaching, his face set in a stern expression. Thompson was a large man in his 40s with a military bearing and a reputation for running a tight ship in his courtroom. "What do you think you're doing?" Thompson demanded, his voice echoing in the empty courtroom. "You're not supposed to be touching the furniture." "That's not your job." James stood up slowly, his knees creaking slightly. "I'm sorry, sir. The chair was loose and I thought—" "You thought wrong," Thompson interrupted, his voice rising. "You're here to clean, not to play handyman. These chairs are expensive, and if you break something, who do you think is going to pay for it?" James felt his face flush with embarrassment. In all his years working at the courthouse, he had never been spoken to so harshly. He had always tried to go above and beyond in his duties, and the idea that his helpfulness was being seen as overstepping made his stomach churn. "I was just trying to help," James said quietly, his accent becoming more pronounced as his anxiety increased. "The chair was wobbly and I didn't want anyone to get hurt." Thompson stepped closer, his badge catching the light from the overhead fixtures. "Listen, Martinez, you need to understand your place here. You're the janitor. You clean. You don't fix things. You don't touch court equipment. And you certainly don't make decisions about what needs to be done around here." Other courthouse employees who had arrived early for work began to gather in the hallway outside the courtroom, drawn by the raised voices. Through the glass doors they could see the confrontation unfolding, but none dared to intervene. Thompson was known for his volatile temper, and few wanted to risk becoming his next target. James felt completely humiliated. The other workers watching made it even worse. These were people he saw every day, people who knew him as a kind and hard-working man. Now they were witnessing him being dressed down like a child who had misbehaved. "I understand, sir," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It won't happen again." But Thompson wasn't finished. "You people need to learn that just because you work here doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. There are rules, there are procedures, and there are boundaries. Your job is to push that cart around and empty trash cans. Nothing more, nothing less." The words "you people" hit James like a physical blow. In those 2 words he heard decades of prejudice and discrimination that he had worked so hard to rise above. He had always believed that his actions and character would speak louder than his accent or his background, but now he felt reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in Thompson's eyes. As James stood there, tool still in his hand, he felt smaller than he had in years. The pride he took in his work, the respect he thought he had earned, all of it seemed to crumble under Thompson's harsh words. He looked down at his uniform, suddenly seeing it not as the badge of honest work he had always considered it, but as a symbol of his place in a hierarchy that would never truly accept him. The morning that had started with such hope and purpose had taken a devastating turn, and James had no idea that in just a few moments, everything would change again in the most unexpected way possible. Just as Bailiff Thompson was preparing to continue his tirade, the courtroom doors opened with a soft whoosh. An elderly man in his 70s entered, walking with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command. He wore a simple gray suit unremarkable except for its impeccable tailoring, and carried himself with a quiet dignity that immediately commanded attention. The man's silver hair was neatly combed, and his weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen both triumph and tragedy. Most people walking past him on the street would assume he was just another retiree, perhaps a grandfather picking up his morning coffee. But James noticed something different about him immediately, the way he held his shoulders, the alert intelligence in his eyes, and most telling of all, the small pin on his lapel that James recognized from his time studying for his citizenship test. Admiral William Bill Henderson had served in the United States Navy for 38 years before retiring 5 years earlier. He had commanded ships in 3 different conflicts, earned the Navy Cross for valor under fire, and had been personally decorated by 2 presidents. But on this morning, he was simply a citizen called for jury duty, arriving early because punctuality had been drilled into him decades ago at the Naval Academy. Henderson had been walking down the hallway when he heard the raised voices coming from the courtroom. His military training had taught him to assess situations quickly, and as he approached the glass doors, he could see what was unfolding inside. A bailiff was berating an older Hispanic man in a janitor's uniform, while courthouse employees gathered in the hallway like spectators at an accident. The Admiral paused for a moment, observing the scene. He watched as the janitor's shoulders sagged under the verbal assault, saw the humiliation in the man's posture, and noticed the small crowd of onlookers who seemed frozen by the uncomfortable display. Henderson had seen enough bullying in his military career to recognize it instantly, and regardless of the setting or circumstances, it always stirred something deep in his core. "Excuse me," Henderson said quietly as he entered the courtroom. His voice carried the unmistakable tone of authority that comes from decades of command. "Is there a problem here?" Thompson turned toward the newcomer, his face still flushed with anger. "No problem at all, sir. Just explaining to the help about proper procedures. Nothing that concerns you." Henderson's eyes narrowed slightly at the dismissive tone and the phrase, "the help." He looked at James, who was still holding the small screwdriver and looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Then he looked back at Thompson, taking note of the bailiff's aggressive posture and the cruel satisfaction in his expression. "I'm Admiral Henderson," he said simply, extending his hand to James. "And you are?" James was so surprised by the introduction that he almost dropped his tool. In all his years at the courthouse, no one had ever introduced themselves to him so formally, especially not someone who was clearly a person of importance. "James Martinez, sir," he replied, wiping his hand quickly on his uniform before shaking the Admiral's firm grip. Thompson's expression shifted slightly as he processed the word Admiral, but his arrogance prevented him from backing down completely. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a courtroom matter. This man was tampering with court equipment, and I was simply—" "You were simply what?" Henderson interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge that made Thompson's words die in his throat. "What exactly was Mr. Martinez doing?" He was fixing a chair without permission," Thompson stammered, suddenly less certain of his ground. "Janitors aren't supposed to touch the furniture. There are procedures, protocols." Henderson walked over to the chair in question and examined it briefly. He could see where James had tightened the loose screws, noting the careful, professional work. "So let me understand this correctly," he said, turning back to face Thompson. "Mr. Martinez noticed that a piece of furniture in this courtroom was potentially unsafe, and he took the initiative to fix it before someone could be injured?" "That's not the point," Thompson said, his voice rising again. "He doesn't have the authority to—" The authority? Henderson's voice cut through Thompson's protests like a blade. Mr. Martinez, how long have you worked in this building? 15 years, sir, James replied quietly, still unsure of what was happening but grateful that someone was finally listening to his side of the story. 15 years, Henderson repeated, looking directly at Thompson. 15 years of faithful service. 15 years of maintaining this building. 15 years of ensuring that the people who work here have a clean, safe environment in which to pursue justice. And you're telling me that in all that time, he hasn't earned the respect to use his judgment about a simple safety issue? The courtroom had fallen completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Through the glass doors, the crowd of courthouse employees had grown larger, all of them straining to hear what was happening inside. Some of them were beginning to whisper among themselves, sharing what they knew about the unfolding drama. Thompson's face was beginning to redden again, but this time it was from embarrassment rather than anger. Sir, I understand what you're saying, but there are rules. There are procedures that everyone has to follow, regardless of how long they've been here. Rules, Henderson said thoughtfully, clasping his hands behind his back in a gesture that James would later learn was a habit the Admiral had developed during decades of pacing ship decks. Let me tell you about rules, Bailiff Thompson. In the Navy, we have more rules and procedures than you can imagine. Rules about everything from how to tie knots to how to engage enemy vessels. But do you know what the most important rule is? Thompson remained silent, sensing that this was not actually a question he was expected to answer. The most important rule, Henderson continued, is that every sailor, from the newest recruit to the most seasoned officer, is treated with dignity and respect. Because when you're in a storm, when your ship is taking on water, when lives are on the line, you need every person working together. You need the cook and the engineer just as much as you need the captain. James felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, though he wasn't entirely sure why. No one had ever spoken about him and his work in such terms. Throughout his life, he had simply tried to do his best, to be helpful, to contribute in whatever way he could. But he had never thought of himself as essential, as someone whose judgment and experience mattered. Henderson turned to face James directly. Mr. Martinez, in your 15 years here, have you ever damaged any equipment or furniture? No, sir, never, James replied with quiet confidence. I always try to be very careful. And I'm sure you do, Henderson said with a slight smile. Because that's what good people do. They take care of the things and the people around them. The Admiral then turned back to Thompson and his smile disappeared. Now, Bailiff Thompson, I have a question for you. In your professional opinion, what would have happened if someone had sat in that chair while it was loose and been injured as a result? Thompson shifted uncomfortably under Admiral Henderson's penetrating stare. The question hung in the air like smoke, and everyone in the courtroom knew that any honest answer would completely undermine his earlier position. Well, I suppose someone could have been hurt, he admitted reluctantly. Could have been hurt, Henderson repeated slowly, savoring each word. And if that someone had been a judge or a lawyer or perhaps a witness giving crucial testimony? What then, Bailiff Thompson? The bailiff's face was now a deep shade of red that clashed with his uniform. There would have been an investigation, I suppose. Questions about building maintenance, safety protocols? Exactly, Henderson said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher leading a student to an inevitable conclusion. There would have been an investigation. And do you know what that investigation would have found? That Mr. Martinez here identified a safety hazard and took appropriate action to prevent injury. They would have commended him for his vigilance and professionalism. James watched this exchange with growing amazement. In the span of just a few minutes, the narrative of his morning had been completely transformed. What had begun as a humiliating scolding was becoming something else entirely. A vindication of everything he had tried to represent in his work and his life. Henderson walked slowly around the courtroom, his hands still clasped behind his back. You know, Bailiff Thompson, I've spent most of my adult life in positions of authority. I've commanded crews of hundreds of men and women, made decisions that affected thousands of lives, and been responsible for equipment worth millions of dollars. And in all that time, I've learned one fundamental truth about leadership. He paused near the judge's bench, his fingers tracing the polished wood. True authority doesn't come from a badge or a title, or the ability to intimidate someone who can't fight back. True authority comes from earning the respect of those around you through your actions, your character, and your treatment of others. The silence in the courtroom was profound. Even the usual sounds of the building seemed muted, as if the very walls were listening to the Admiral's words. Through the glass doors, James could see that more people had gathered in the hallway. Word was spreading throughout the courthouse that something significant was happening in courtroom 3. "Mr. Martinez," Henderson said, turning to face the janitor directly. "Would you mind telling me a bit about yourself? Your family, perhaps?" James was startled by the personal question. In 15 years of working in the courthouse, very few people had ever asked him about his life outside these walls. "I have a wife, Maria, and 2 children. My daughter, Elena, is a teacher at the elementary school, and my son, Carlos, is an engineer. They both graduated from college." "Both graduated from college," Henderson repeated with genuine warmth in his voice. "That's quite an achievement. You must be very proud." "Yes, sir, very proud," James said, and for the first time that morning he allowed himself to smile. "They worked very hard, and I'm sure they had a good example to follow," Henderson said. "A father who gets up every morning and goes to work, who takes pride in what he does, who contributes to his community. That's the kind of example that shapes young people into successful adults." Thompson was beginning to look increasingly uncomfortable as he realized that the dynamics in the room had shifted completely. What had started as his moment of authority had become something entirely different. He was no longer the one in control of the situation, and worse, he was beginning to look like the villain in a story where he had expected to be the hero. "Admiral," Thompson said, attempting to reassert himself, "I appreciate what you're saying, but the fact remains that there are procedures in place for a reason. We can't have everyone in the building deciding for themselves what needs to be fixed or changed." Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right, Bailiff Thompson. Procedures are important. They provide structure and ensure that things are done properly. But procedures should serve people, not the other way around. And when someone with 15 years of experience and an unblemished record makes a minor repair to prevent a potential injury, that's not a violation of procedure. That's the procedure working exactly as it should." Admiral walked over to where James was standing and examined the toolkit that was still in the janitor's hands. "These are quality tools," he observed. "Well-maintained, properly organized. Mr. Martinez, where did you learn to do repair work?" "My father was a carpenter back in El Salvador," James explained. "He taught me when I was young. I've always been good with my hands, fixing things around the house, helping neighbors when they need something repaired." "A carpenter's son," Henderson said with approval. "There's nobility in working with your hands, in building and maintaining and fixing the things that make civilization possible. Some of the finest men I've ever served with came from families of craftsmen and builders." Henderson then did something that surprised everyone in the room. He picked up one of James's tools, a small screwdriver with a worn wooden handle, and examined it closely. "This tool has seen some use," he said. "I'd guess it belonged to your father." James nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "He gave it to me when I left El Salvador. He said that as long as I had tools and the willingness to work, I would never go hungry in America." "Your father was a wise man," Henderson said, carefully placing the tool back in James's hands. "And he was right. This country was built by people like you and your father. People who weren't afraid of hard work, who took pride in doing things right, who understood that every job, no matter how small it might seem to others, is important." The Admiral then turned to face the crowd that had gathered in the hallway outside the courtroom. Through the glass doors he could see judges, lawyers, clerks, and other courthouse staff all watching the scene unfold. Some of them were checking their phones, undoubtedly texting about what they were witnessing to colleagues throughout the building. "You know," Henderson said, his voice carrying clearly to those outside, "I came here this morning for jury duty. I expected to spend the day listening to evidence and deliberating with my fellow citizens, but instead I've been reminded of something far more important than any single trial." He gestured toward James, who was still standing quietly with his toolkit, looking overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "I've been reminded that justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms. It happens every day, in every interaction we have with each other. It happens when we choose to treat people with dignity regardless of their job title or background. It happens when we recognize that every person has value and deserves respect." The weight of Admiral Henderson's words settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Even Thompson seemed to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. This was no longer just about a janitor fixing a chair. This had become a moment of reckoning, a public examination of values and character that would be remembered long after the participants had gone home. Henderson walked toward the courtroom doors. Addressing the growing crowd in the hallway, "I see many familiar faces out there. People I've met during my previous jury service, people who work every day to ensure that justice is served in this building. And I want to ask all of you a question. How do we expect to achieve justice in our legal proceedings if we cannot achieve it in our daily interactions with each other?" Judge Patricia Williams, who had arrived early to prepare for her morning docket, pushed through the crowd to get a better view. She was a respected jurist with 20 years on the bench, known for her fairness and her sharp intellect. As she watched the scene unfold, she found herself thinking about all the times she had seen James working quietly in her courtroom. Always professional, always thorough, never causing any trouble. "Mr. Martinez," Henderson continued, "I want you to know that what happened here this morning was not about you or your actions. You did nothing wrong. In fact, you did everything right. You saw a problem, you had the skills to fix it, and you took action to prevent someone from being hurt. That's not just good work, that's good citizenship." James felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't even realized was there. For 15 years he had worked in this building feeling like he was on the outside looking in, grateful for his job but always aware that he was seen as just the janitor. But in this moment, with this distinguished stranger speaking about his work with such respect, he began to see himself differently. "But more importantly," Henderson said, turning back to face Thompson, "what happened here this morning reveals something troubling about how authority is exercised in this building. Bailiff Thompson, you have a position of trust. People rely on you to maintain order, to ensure safety, to represent the values of the justice system. But instead of recognizing good work when you saw it, you chose to belittle and humiliate a man who was simply trying to do his job well." Thompson's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he might try to defend himself again. But something in Henderson's demeanor, the quiet authority, the moral certainty, the obvious support of the growing crowd, made him think better of it. "And your comment about you people," Henderson continued, his voice dropping to a more dangerous tone, "was particularly troubling. Mr. Martinez is not you people. He is an American citizen, a taxpayer, a father, a husband, and a valued member of this community. He deserves to be treated with the same respect you would show to anyone else in this building." The phrase "you people" had not gone unnoticed by the courthouse staff, several of whom were themselves immigrants or children of immigrants. Maria Santos, a court clerk whose parents had come from Mexico, felt her anger rising as she remembered all the times she had heard similar language directed at her family. David Kim, a young attorney whose grandparents had fled Korea during the war, clenched his fists as he thought about the casual prejudice that still existed in professional settings. Judge Williams decided she had heard enough. She stepped into the courtroom, her black robes rustling softly. "Admiral Henderson," she said, "I want to thank you for bringing this situation to light. And Mr. Martinez, I want to personally apologize for what you've experienced this morning." The appearance of Judge Williams in the courtroom caused a stir among the onlookers. She was widely respected throughout the courthouse, and her presence gave additional weight to the Admiral's words. "In my 20 years on this bench," she continued, "I have never seen Mr. Martinez do anything but exemplary work. He has always been professional, reliable, and helpful. The idea that he should be berated for preventing a potential safety hazard is unconscionable." Thompson was now completely isolated. What had started as a simple assertion of authority had spiraled into a public humiliation. He could see the disapproval in the faces around him, could sense that his reputation in the courthouse had been damaged, perhaps irreparably. "Bailiff Thompson," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the full authority of her position, "I will be speaking with the chief judge about this incident. Your behavior this morning was inappropriate and unprofessional. Mr. Martinez deserves a formal apology, and I expect you to provide one immediately." Thompson looked around the room, seeing no allies, no escape from the situation he had created. The crowd in the hallway was still growing, and he could hear people whispering about what they had witnessed. He realized that within hours, everyone in the courthouse would know what had happened, and his reputation would be forever linked to this moment. "Mr. Martinez," Thompson said reluctantly, his voice barely audible, I apologize for my comments this morning. You were just trying to help, and I overreacted." James looked at the bailiff for a long moment, then nodded quietly. "Thank you," he said simply. "I accept your apology." The grace with which James accepted the apology impressed everyone present. Despite being publicly humiliated, despite being subjected to prejudiced comments, he responded with dignity and forgiveness. It was, Henderson thought, a perfect example of the character that had been on display all morning. "Mr. Martinez," Henderson said, "I have one more thing I'd like to say to you. In the Navy, we have a tradition of recognizing exceptional service. We give medals and commendations, we promote people, we acknowledge their contributions publicly. But sometimes the most important recognition is simply acknowledging someone's worth as a human being." The Admiral reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card. It was his personal business card, with his address and phone number. "I want you to have this," he said, pressing the card into James's hand. "If you or your family ever need anything at all, I want you to call me. A man who has served this community as faithfully as you have for 15 years has earned the right to ask for help when he needs it." James stared at the card, his hands trembling slightly. In all his life, no one of Admiral Henderson's stature had ever offered to help him. The gesture was so unexpected, so generous, that he found himself struggling to speak. "Thank you, sir," he finally managed. "This means more to me than you can know." Henderson smiled and patted James gently on the shoulder. "Mr. Martinez, it has been an honor to meet you, and I want you to know that when I go home tonight and my wife asks me about my day, I'm going to tell her about meeting a man who represents the very best of what America can be." As Admiral Henderson's words echoed through the courtroom, something remarkable began to happen. The crowd in the hallway, which had been silent observers to the unfolding drama, began to move into the courtroom. One by one, courthouse employees who had worked alongside James for years stepped forward to offer their own words of support. Maria Santos, the court clerk, was the first to speak. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I want you to know that in my 8 years working here, you have always treated everyone with kindness and respect. You remember people's names, you ask about their families, and you always have a smile for everyone you meet." David Kim, the young attorney, nodded in agreement. "Last year, when I was working late preparing for my first big trial, you stayed after hours to make sure I had coffee and that the building was secure. You didn't have to do that, but you did it anyway. That's the kind of person you are." Judge Williams looked around the room with growing satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of response she had hoped to see from her courthouse family. "Mr. Martinez," she said, "I think it's clear that you have more friends and admirers here than you might have realized." Even some of the attorneys who had arrived for the morning docket began to speak up. Robert Chen, a defense attorney who had been practicing in the courthouse for over a decade, stepped forward. "James, do you remember when my father visited from Taiwan last month? You spent your lunch break showing him around the building, even though he couldn't speak much English. My father still talks about the kind American man who made him feel welcome." James felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. He had always tried to be friendly and helpful, but he had never realized that his small gestures had made such an impact on the people around him. Each story shared reminded him of a moment when he had simply tried to be kind, never expecting recognition or reward. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic expert who frequently testified in the courthouse, had been watching from the hallway and decided to add her voice. "James once found my car keys when I dropped them in the parking lot during a snowstorm. He spent 20 minutes searching in the cold until he found them. When I tried to give him money as a thank you, he refused and just said he was glad he could help." Admiral Henderson watched this spontaneous testimonial with deep satisfaction. This was exactly what he had hoped would happen. Not just a defense of James's actions that morning, but a recognition of his character and contributions over many years. The Admiral had seen enough of life to know that true character reveals itself in small, everyday actions rather than grand gestures. Bailiff Thompson stood to the side, looking increasingly uncomfortable as each person spoke. The contrast between the respect and affection being shown to James and his own earlier behavior was becoming more stark with each testimony. He began to realize that he hadn't just attacked a janitor that morning, he had attacked someone who was genuinely beloved by the courthouse community. Mrs. Eleanor Foster, an elderly court reporter who had worked in the building for over 30 years, made her way slowly into the courtroom with her walking cane. "If I may," she said in her refined voice, "I would like to add my perspective to this discussion." The room fell silent out of respect for Mrs. Foster, who was something of a legend in the courthouse. She had transcribed some of the most important trials in the district's history and was known for her impeccable professionalism and sharp memory. "In my 32 years in this building," she began, "I have seen many people come and go. I have watched bailiffs, clerks, attorneys, and judges begin their careers here and move on to other positions. But Mr. Martinez is one of the constants. He has been a steady, reliable presence who makes this building function smoothly." She paused to adjust her glasses, a gesture that everyone recognized as a sign that she was about to make an important point. But more than that, he represents something that we sometimes lose sight of in our legal proceedings. He represents the dignity of honest work, the value of service to others, and the importance of treating every person with respect regardless of their position. Admiral Henderson found himself nodding in agreement. Mrs. Foster had articulated exactly what he had been trying to express. "Mrs. Foster," he said, "you've captured something essential. This building, this justice system doesn't function because of any one person, no matter how important they might think they are. It functions because of all the people who contribute their skills and dedication every day." Judge Williams looked at her watch and realized that the morning docket would be starting soon. But she also recognized that what was happening in this courtroom was more important than any single trial. "I'm going to postpone the start of court this morning," she announced. "I think we're witnessing something that deserves our full attention." James looked around the room at all the faces, some familiar, some less so, all focused on him with expressions of respect and affection. He thought about the morning that had started with such promise, had taken such a devastating turn, and was now ending in a way he could never have imagined. "I don't know what to say," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I just try to do my job the best I can. I never thought—" "That's exactly the point," Admiral Henderson said gently. "You don't do good work because you expect recognition. You do it because it's who you are. That's what makes your character so genuine and so valuable." The Admiral then addressed the entire room. "I want everyone here to remember this moment. Not because of what Bailiff Thompson did wrong, but because of what Mr. Martinez did right. And more importantly, because of how this community responded when one of its members was treated unfairly." Henderson walked to the center of the courtroom, his bearing commanding attention even in the informal gathering. "In my military career, I learned that the true measure of an organization isn't how it treats its most important members. It's how it treats its most vulnerable ones. Today, you have all shown that this courthouse is an organization of integrity and decency." Dr. Patricia Reeves, a psychologist who often served as an expert witness, had been listening thoughtfully to the entire exchange. "Admiral Henderson," she said, "you've given us all a masterclass in leadership today. You saw an injustice and you addressed it directly, but you also created space for others to speak and for healing to begin." The Admiral smiled modestly. "I just did what any decent person should do in the same situation. The real credit goes to all of you for creating a community where someone like Mr. Martinez can flourish and be appreciated." As the testimonials continued, it became clear that James had touched more lives than he had ever realized. His quiet kindness, his reliability, his genuine care for others had created ripples throughout the courthouse community. People shared stories of small favors, kind words, and moments of consideration that had brightened their days over the years. Thompson remained silent throughout this outpouring of support, but those watching him could see that he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. He hadn't just been harsh with an employee. He had attacked someone who was genuinely cherished by the people who— 3 weeks after that transformative morning in Courtroom 3, the Norfolk Federal Courthouse had settled into a new rhythm. Word of the incident had spread far beyond the building's walls, reaching local news outlets and social media platforms. The story of Admiral Henderson defending James Martinez had become a symbol of dignity triumphing over prejudice, and both men had received letters and messages from strangers across the country. James arrived at work each morning to find that his interactions with courthouse staff had fundamentally changed. Where once he had been greeted with polite nods and brief smiles, he now found himself engaged in genuine conversations. People asked about his family, shared stories from their own lives, and treated him as the valued community member he had always been, but had rarely been acknowledged as being. Judge Williams had followed, threw on her promise to speak with the chief judge about Thompson's behavior. The bailiff had been formally reprimanded and required to attend sensitivity training sessions. More importantly, he had been assigned to work directly with James on a courthouse beautification project, forcing him to see the janitor as a skilled craftsman rather than just the help. The partnership had started awkwardly, with Thompson clearly uncomfortable and James maintaining his characteristic dignity despite the circumstances. But as they worked together to repair damaged woodwork and improve the building's appearance, something unexpected began to develop between them. "James," Thompson said one afternoon as they worked to restore an old bench in the courthouse lobby, "I need to say something to you. That apology I gave you in the courtroom, it wasn't enough. I was angry and embarrassed, and I just wanted the situation to go away." James continued sanding the bench's armrest, his movements steady and practiced. "What do you want to say now?" he asked quietly. Thompson set down his own tool and looked directly at James. "I want to say that I was wrong. Not just about the chair, but about everything. The way I spoke to you, the things I implied about your place here, the disrespect I showed you as a person. I was completely wrong, and I'm genuinely sorry." For the first time since their confrontation, James stopped his work and looked directly at Thompson. He could see that this apology was different from the forced one in the courtroom. This one came from understanding rather than obligation. "I accept your apology," James said simply, "and I want you to know that I don't hold anger in my heart toward you. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after we make them." This conversation marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Thompson began to appreciate James's skill and knowledge, while James saw past Thompson's gruff exterior to recognize someone who was capable of growth and change. Their collaboration on courthouse projects became so successful that other departments began requesting their assistance. Admiral Henderson had kept his promise to stay in touch with James. The two men met for coffee every few weeks, and Henderson had even attended Carlos's engineering graduation ceremony. During one of their conversations, Henderson made an observation that surprised James. "You know," the Admiral said, stirring sugar into his coffee, "I've been thinking about that morning we met. Everyone talks about how I stood up for you, but I think they're missing the real story." "What do you mean?" James asked. "The real story is how you handled yourself. When Thompson was berating you, when you were being humiliated in front of your colleagues, you never lost your dignity. You never struck back with anger or tried to hurt him in return. That takes a kind of strength that most people never develop." James considered this. "My father always told me that how we treat people when we're angry reveals who we really are. He said that anyone can be kind when things are going well, but it takes character to be kind when someone is treating you badly." Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "Your father was a wise man, and he raised a son who embodies those values." The impact of that morning had extended beyond personal relationships to create institutional changes within the courthouse. Judge Williams had worked with the administration to establish new protocols for recognizing the contributions of all courthouse employees. A monthly awards program now highlighted exceptional service by support staff, and professional development opportunities had been expanded to include everyone who worked in the building. Mrs. Foster had suggested creating a courthouse newsletter to share positive stories about staff, members, and their contributions to the community. The first issue featured a prominent article about James, complete with photos of his restoration work and testimonials from colleagues. When James saw his picture on the front page, he felt a sense of pride that went beyond personal recognition. He felt truly valued as a member of the courthouse family. The changes weren't limited to formal programs. The culture of the building had shifted in subtle but important ways. Attorneys began taking time to greet support staff by name. Judges made efforts to acknowledge the work of clerks and bailiffs in their courtrooms. And throughout the building, there was a renewed awareness of the dignity and importance of every person's contribution. 6 months after the incident, Admiral Henderson received an invitation that touched him deeply. James and Maria were celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary, and they wanted him to be their guest of honor at the celebration. The party was held in the community center of the neighborhood where the Martinez family had lived for 15 years. As Henderson looked around the room filled with family, friends, and colleagues from the courthouse, he was struck by the warmth and love that surrounded James and Maria. Elena, now a respected teacher, gave a speech about her father's example of hard work and integrity. Carlos talked about how his father's dedication to excellence had inspired his own engineering career. But it was Thompson's presence at the celebration that surprised Henderson the most. The bailiff had not only attended but had brought his own family to meet the Martinez family. His teenage daughter was fascinated by Carlos's engineering work, and Thompson's wife found herself deep in conversation with Maria about their shared experiences as military wives. Thompson had served in the army before becoming a bailiff. During the evening, Thompson pulled Henderson aside for a private conversation. "Admiral," he said, "I wanted to thank you for what you did that morning in the courtroom." Henderson looked puzzled. "Thank me? I thought you might still be angry about that." "Angry?" Thompson shook his head. "No, sir. You opened my eyes to something I had been blind to. You helped me see that I had become someone I didn't want to be. That morning was painful, but it was also a gift. It gave me the chance to change." As the evening continued, Henderson found himself reflecting on the unexpected ways that single moments can transform multiple lives. His decision to speak up that morning had started as a simple act of decency, but it had created ripples that continued to spread throughout the community. When it came time for Henderson to speak to the gathered crowd, he chose his words carefully. "James and Maria," he began, 30 years ago, you made a commitment to each other and to the future you would build together. That future included not just your beautiful family, but the countless lives you would touch through your kindness, your work and your example." He paused to look around the room, seeing faces that had become familiar from the courthouse community. "James, you once told me that your father said you would never go hungry in America as long as you had tools and the willingness to work. Your father was right, but he could have added something else. He could have said that as long as you treat people with dignity and respect, you will never lack for friends and community." The celebration continued late into the evening, with stories shared, laughter exchanged, and new friendships formed. As Henderson prepared to leave, James walked him to his car. "Admiral," James said, "I want you to know that meeting you changed my life, not just because of what you did that morning, but because of the friendship you've given me since then. You helped me see myself the way others see me." Henderson smiled and shook James's hand firmly. "James, the honor has been entirely mine. That morning in the courtroom I thought I was helping you, but the truth is you helped me remember what really matters in life. You reminded me that heroism isn't just about grand gestures or medals or recognition. Sometimes it's about getting up every morning and doing your job with pride and integrity, treating everyone you meet with kindness, and making the world a little bit better through your daily actions." As Henderson drove home that night, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with a simple act of speaking up for what was right. The incident that had started as a moment of injustice had become a story of redemption, community, and the power of recognizing the dignity in every person. The loose chair that James had fixed that morning still sat in courtroom 3, now solid and secure. But more than furniture had been repaired that day. Relationships had been healed, prejudices had been confronted, and a community had rediscovered the values that bound them together. In the end, it wasn't just the bailiff who had been stopped cold by the Admiral's words. It was an entire community that had been awakened to the power of treating each person with the respect and dignity they deserved.